first time here. It's just been 3, 4 days. So this is one paper that I'm going to. Oh, all right. I use that this one. Hey, hey, yeah, this is all right. So, yeah, so this is the first paper that I'm going to present today. And there's another seminar that's scheduled next week, I guess. So that's going to be another paper. Yeah. Right. Okay, thank you. So this paper is a joint work with Gaurav, who was a PhD student at the Shiv University. And Gaurav is currently an assistant professor at IIT Hyderabad. So the title might, so first it's a bit long, and second it might appear to be a little bit gibberish because you have this term hypogamy there, and there's this term that not many of you are familiar probably, which is non-parametric bounds. So we'll talk about all that. So let me just get started because I have about 45 minutes and try to wrap up. And if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me. All right, so the issue that this paper looks at, since all of you here work on development, you are probably aware of this, right? It's a widely discussed issue in the popular press, in peer-reviewed journals, and that is that if you look at women's labor force participation rate in rural parts of India, there's been a sharp decline, right? So it's like the decline has been seen from 1990s and it's sort of continuing. And there's been research which sort of finds that this decline in labor force participation of women, this seems to be driven mainly by currently married women. So currently married women comprise about 85% of total rural women in the 25-65 age group. And this decline seems to be driven by them. So there's Farzana's paper, which Farzana and Kanika, they look at this and they sort of assert this. So this decline in rural females labor force participation, this of course is in contrast with global trends. If you look at developed countries, women labor force participation has been rising over time, which is what it's supposed to be as countries are developed. That's what it's supposed to be. Not just that, this is also puzzling because in India, if you look at education and fertility of rural women, those seem to be the growth or the trend of education as well as fertility rates. That seems to be inconsistent with what we observe in the data, right? So if you look at education, women have made large. So the not literate population of women, that is sort of falling, and educated women at all levels, that seems to be rising, right? And that's true for any survey you take. At the same time, the fertility data, you see that there's a drop in fertility. There's a gradual drop in fertility from again.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you share the paper as it's not visible here?
You have to share. आता मी राहू ना इथे.
Hey, Shelly.
So this now should be visible to the remote audience, right? Yeah, so if you look at education and fertility, there's been a rise in education of women in rural India. There's been a drop in fertility rates in rural India. So therefore, this is a puzzle that has sort of grabbed attention of economists, of demographers for quite some time. Now, if you look at the literature, of course, by now there's been a large literature that has grown around this. So there are, you can sort of think about 5 major causes based on the literature. So one is that women in rural India, they're pursuing higher education, and therefore they are not available for workforce. So they are not just working. So they're pursuing education. The second explanation that is proposed is that increases in women's education have increased women's relative returns to home production compared to market production. Right? The third set of explanation, the third set of papers say that household incomes have increased massively in rural India due to higher wage levels, which is true, and that has taken the pressure off of women to seek employment. So they don't have to go to work because their husbands are earning at all. And then, of course, there's this the demand side explanation that's proposed by some people who say that there's been a decline in the opportunities that women could sort of make use of when it comes to work. And finally, there's a recent paper, I think this is still a working paper, again by Farzana and others, which say that norms could be playing a role. So basically, they say that there can be constraints that social norms impose that regarding gender division of labor. So there's kind of a requirement of women contributing a certain number of hours to home production and so on and so on. So these are the 5 basic, broadly talking, explanations that can be found in the literature. So in this paper, we contribute to this growing body of literature, and we propose a new and which to our mind is somewhat novel explanation of this decline in female labor force participation in rural India. So our explanation is basically that there has been an increase in educational hypogamy in rural India over time, and that perhaps that plays a major role. Now, what is educational hypogamy? So educational hypogamy basically refers to marriages where the wives are more educated than their husbands. That is what hypogamy means. Right? So if you before getting into what is sort of the theory that motivates us, I'll just show you these 2 pictures, which sort of clearly shows that hypogamous marriages as a proportion of total marriages that has been increasing in India ever since 1992. So this is based on the NFHS, the first panel. So you see that the proportion of hypogamous marriages, so marriages in which wives are more educated than their husbands, that has been rising. And this picture is for different cohorts, marriage cohorts, and we find a similar trend for NFHS as well as for the India Human Development Survey. Right? So these 2 pictures are sort of telling, and therefore it sort of clearly establishes where we are coming from. Before going into the explanation of the link between hypogamy, the possible link between hypogamy and female labor force participation, a few things which are important to recognize is that one is that the increase in hypogamy that we have seen, that these pictures show, this has primarily happened because women have become more educated, and not because of gender norm reversals. So it's basically women, their marriage pools are restricted by caste networks, kinship networks, and so on. And these programs that you see of women, whatever, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, these have made women more educated, right? So the women sort of by default end up marrying men who are less educated than them. So that is the main cause of the increase in hypogamy that you see here. And there's literature which says that
Yes.
there are no reversals in gender.
अभी वो मीटिंग में बाद में बात करें. अभी मीटिंग में around 6. Okay.
Okay, so there's literature that says that it's not that gender norms are changing, and that's why that women are marrying men who are less educated than them. That's not what is happening. Gender inequality is still everywhere in the Indian society. Arranged marriage is near universal. Patriarchal norms of all kinds are completely prevalent in rural India, especially. And I like this quote from this paper by Lin and co-author. So this is a paper published in Demography, where they sort of argue that it is a definitive no. If you ask the question that whether educational hypogamy that's increasing because gender norms are improving in the society, they say it's a no, because they go on to talk about how they see that gender norms are still prevalent in the society. So basically, that's the point that one needs to recognize. So what we say here, so the first thing that's clear is that so hypogamy has been increasing in India, female labor force participation has been going down. So we say here, so we hypothesize here that women in hypogamous marriages have less likelihood to participate in the labor market compared to their counterparts. So women who are in non-hypogamous marriages, they have a higher likelihood to participate in a work. Now, if this hypothesis is true, and given that hypogamy has been increasing in India, which was evident in the two pictures, a decline in married women's labor force participation rate should not be surprising, right? And since the overall, decline in women's labor force participation has been driven by married women's labor force participation rate, therefore, essentially, if this hypothesis is true, this could be a reason why we sort of are observing this overall decline in women's labor force participation rate. So, of course, the question here is, therefore, the question boils down to that whether this hypothesis is true or not, and what is the underlying theory based on which we have sort of constructed this hypothesis. So what is the motivation behind this hypothesis? That if you are in a hypogamous marriage, you have a lower likelihood of participating in the labor force. Why would that be the case? I think that's the case.
The matching could be difficult in terms of job search, could be difficult for better educated women. They might not find jobs which match their qualifications.
Yeah. I mean, those, so we are just saying this is one reason, this could be one reason, but of course, the matching process and you're overeducated and all that, that could be playing a role as well, which is of course established in literature. But we are just saying this could be another possible reason for this to be happening. Yeah.
So is it possible that if I'm from the right side and I look for a match with whom let's say my daughter, I feel lower down?
Not sure about that. I'm not.
How do we know whether the boundaries are going up or falling or seeing?
The
I'm wondering whether this, what you're observing could be driven by the incentive to be lower down.
I need to check that. I mean, it's an interesting question, but I don't have an answer to that right now. So let me just talk a little bit about. So I'll just talk briefly about the motivating theory. So why could it be that women who are in hypogamous marriages, they might be having lower likelihood to participate in the labor force? So, so rural India is a deeply, it's deeply patriarchal. There's no question about it, right? And women in deeply patriarchal societies, they are expected to be in non-hypogamous marriages. So you're supposed to marry someone who is more educated. So a woman is supposed to marry someone who is more educated and or has a high earning power. So in terms of economic status, she or the husband, the prospective husband, should have a higher standing. Right? So what happens in hypogamy? So when you end up in a hypogamous marriage, that sort of undermines this, this gender norm. So this sort of violates this patriarchal belief and norms, which suggests that wives should be less educated than the husbands. The husband should be the primary breadwinner in the home, and so on. So the women who end up in such marriages, in hypogamous marriages, they are perceived as challenging the dominant concepts of masculinity. So they are sort of challenging the gender norms. They are breaking the patriarchal beliefs and so on. As a consequence, they may face repercussions in form of stress, tension, or domestic violence. So IPV is basically intimate partner violence, which you can interpret as domestic violence. So it's sort of a male backlash that could occur. And there's a large sociological literature which says that when the wife's economic status in terms of education sort of exceeds that of the husband, then male backlash is gone. Now, this male backlash, yeah. This one? Yeah, we actually show this in the paper also. So what happens is that when women are exposed to intimate partner violence, that of course large literature shows that IPV affects women's mental health, physical health, and so on. That translates into sort of that leads to a reduction of their likelihood of joining the labor force if they are currently not working, and if they are currently working, the constant the tussle that happens at the home, that sort of contributes to them dropping out from the labor force. In fact, Seema Jayachandran, so this is her sort of survey paper in IMF Economic Review. She says that you don't even have to be exposed to IPV. If you anticipate that you are going to be beaten up by your husband, or there's going to be destabilization in the marriage relationship, you will probably not go out and work. In fact, there are several studies which have shown that IPV, exposure to IPV, adversely affects women's outcome, women's labor force participation. And for India, there has been a recent study which shows that in the transport sector, this is clearly sort of visible. So therefore, compared to women in non-hypogamous marriages, women in hypogamous marriages are likely to have a lower probability of participating in the labor force owing to either actual exposure to IPV or anticipated exposure to IPV. So this paper, what do we do? So this is a theory, right? This is sort of the, so I'm not a theorist, neither is Gaurav. So our theory is basically this: we can't make, fine and sophisticated micro model, which many of you can probably. So our theory is this. Although if any of you want to develop a model based on this, please let us know. So what we do in this paper, and this is what we do, is we examine this theory in 2 steps. First, we test whether hypogamy leads to a decrease in likelihood of women's participation in the labor force. And next, we examine whether the underlying mechanism that connects hypogamy to women's participation in the labor force is indeed IPV. So whether one mechanism is IPV, let me put it in that. So I'm going to actually skip over. So how much time do I have?
Yeah, 20.
So I'm going to skip over the literature and contribution. So we contribute to 2 broad areas of literature. So the slides are with Bart. So you can sort of take a look at the literature if you're interested in, but I'm going to skip over this for the interest of time. Our data also, I'm going to go very quickly because we use 2 publicly available data sets, which in IGIDA probably everybody knows about it. So we use the NFHs, all the rounds of NFHs starting from 2004-5, and then we use the India Human Development Survey, the latest one, which is 2011-12. So nothing to talk about. Okay, so the covariate of interest is educational hypogamy, and we so whether a marital relationship can be called as hypogamous or not. So we measure it with the binary variable, which takes a value 1. If the wife's education, the reported education, reported years of schooling exceeds that of the husband, and 0 otherwise. So it's a straightforward dummy variable that we use. Okay, the outcome variables are different indicators of labor force participation. We use, currently whether you're employed, whether you were employed in any work in last 1 year, currently whether you're employed in paid work, and currently whether you were you had some kind of a paid job in last 1 year. Of course, we don't have all the variables in both the survey, and if we basically have the first and the fourth are present only in NFHs, not IHTs. Okay, so as I mentioned, that we tried to look at the mechanism, underlying mechanism, and whether hypogamy leads to an increase in exposure to IPV. So we use some variables that capture IPV, that's from NFHs. So there's anticipation of IPV, that whether you're whether or not you're afraid of your husband. And then we have some actual reported IPV measures that we use from NFH. And these are all. All right, so let's come to the empirical model that we use. Now, you cannot possibly just compare labor force participation rate of women who are in hypogamous marriages to labor force participation of women who are in non-hypogamous marriages, and take the difference and say that, okay, this is my, this is the causal estimate of being in a hypogamous marriage or being in a hypogamy. That's because there is this usual problem of unobserved confounders, right? And you can think of many unobserved confounders, but the primary ones that we think would confound our estimate, it would be ability, could be gender and so on. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. So if these these unobserved variables differ systematically across the two groups, then it could be that the observed difference or the difference that you would compute in the labor force participation rates of these two groups, that could be actually be driven by these unobserved, confounders rather than, the marriage type itself. So, you would probably want to sort of do traditional causal methods like IV, instrumental variable, or DIV. But these methods in this case doesn't seem to be very useful unless and until you invoke very strong assumptions, right? So I guess there are many fans of DID here. So if you're doing development, DID is something that becomes your bread and butter. So DID or these things don't seem to be applicable here. So of course, so speaking generally, if you encounter a problem like this, so you have an interesting question, but the traditional methods don't work. One thing you can do is you just discard the question, right? Or run an OLS and say that you've just got some correlation. The other approach is that think of any different econometric method which could be used instead of the traditional ones to get the causal estimates. So what we do, we sort of take that second route. So we examine the relationship between hypogamy and labor force participation rate by using what is known as the partial identification approach. So we try to identify the treatment effect, so the causal estimate, the causal effect of hypogamy on labor force participation rate. But we use a partial identification method. So what is partial identification method? Partial identification method is a method which gives you the causal estimate, but does not give you a point causal estimate. So it just tells you that the causal estimate will lie between two numbers. So you'll sort of be computing a bound for the causal estimate. So the true effect you cannot compute using IV, using DID. So let's use a method which although will not allow me to compute the point estimate of the true effect, but I can at least bound that estimate somehow. So we'll try to sort of infer something based on those bounds and see whether those inferences make sense or not. So that's the underlying philosophy. So if the option is that you identify the point, that you sort of estimate that point or identify nothing, so it takes sort of a middle ground. So we to proceed, we define the average treatment effect. So it's sort of a non-parametric average treatment effect, where Y is the realized labor force participation rate, which is binary, and Y1, Y0, these are potential labor force participation outcome of a woman if she were in a hypogamous marriage. That's Y is 1, and Y0 is the potential labor force participation outcome of a woman if she were in a non-hypogamous. Right? So therefore, the AT, what does it reveal? It reveals that how the mean outcome that would differ if all women were in hypogamous marriage versus the mean outcome if all women were in non-hypogamous. So we are sort of operating in this counterfactual world. Now the problem is that Y1 is observed only for women who are in hypogamous marriages. It is not observed for women in non-hypogamous marriages. Similarly, Y0 is observed for only their counterparts, like the women who are in non-hypogamous marriages. So that's unobserved for women who are in hypogamous marriages. So basically, we face a problem of missing counterfactuals. And therefore, you just based on the data, you cannot identify the two components here. If we could have identified, then we could have just used the data by hand, we could compute this and we are done. But we can't do that because of the problem of counterfactuals. And that I've illustrated here that if you if you take the first term and use the law of total probability and you sort of expand that, you would get this expansion, which you see that it comprises of 4 terms. Out of the 4 terms, 1 term is unobserved. So this is observed from the data, where, so H, by the way, I should have said. So H is base, H equal to 1 denotes that women is in a hypogamous marriage. H equal to 0 is that you're not in a hypogamous marriage. This is observed, this you can compute from the data, that's observed, this is unobserved. Right? So basically so this illustrates that these two terms you cannot simply back out from the data. So therefore, our approach makes a few assumptions. The baseline, sort of the benchmark case is that we start with no assumption on selection. So it's no selection assumption. So we just make use of the information that this unobserved term that you see, that's a probability, right? And therefore it lies between 1 and 0. That's all what we know. We make use of that information and bound these two terms. So I don't think is the laser work. Right? Is it? Whatever. I can see the red light. Yeah, okay. All right, thank you. So these two terms we need to sort of have an idea about these two terms. So we can bound these two terms to start with just this information that the probabilities, the unobserved probabilities lie between 0 and 1. And then we place bounds on these two terms. Now, if we take the difference between the upper bound of the first term and the lower bound of this, then we obtain sort of the tightest bound on 80 without making any further assumption. So this is the first step. It's a benchmark case. The problem here is that these bounds that you compute here are, by construction, they have a width of unity. So these bounds will definitely include 0. Hence, what these bounds say that your treatment effect, actual treatment effect, will be in this range, but that could be 0 as well, because these bounds will include 0. So the bounds are generally not useful to sign the average treatment effect. Right? So you cannot go beyond this by just not using any further assumption. So therefore, we move to the next step, where we use the assumption of a monotone treatment selection, MTS. So this MTS assumption, this places structure on the selection mechanism. So this assumes that the expected potential outcomes move in a particular direction conditional on treatment assignment. Right? So basically what we are saying is that in our case, so we assume that women in hypogamous marriages are no less likely to participate in the labor force than women in non-hypogamous marriages conditional on treatment assignment. So to start with, we are saying that women in hypogamous marriages have equal or higher probability of participating in the labor force. So that's the positive monotone treatment selection assumption. And under this assumption, you can derive the bounds. It's sort of computationally, it's a little bit demanding. So it's derived in Kreider's paper. So you can look at that, but you can derive the bounds for that. Now the question is that this assumption is, it's important. So what, how can we justify this assumption? So if you look at the data, which we have shown here, so women who are in hypogamous marriages seems to be in an advantageous position compared to women in non-hypogamous marriages to start with. Right? So if you look at education, for instance, women who are in hypogamous marriages, they have much higher levels of education compared to their counterparts. If you assume that ability is correlated with education, then this unobserved ability is also likely to be higher for the women who are in hypogamous marriages. And education and ability potentially, these could make women more likely to participate in the labor force, in the labor market. So to start with, women who are in hypogamous marriages might have an edge over the counterparts in terms of participating in the labor force.
theory of the paper is that they could be facing male backlash. Shouldn't the assumption actually be opposite based on what you were saying in the beginning?
No, we are just saying that to start with, if you are in a hypogamous marriage versus you are in a non-hypogamous marriage, everything else remaining the same. Then we are saying that to start with, the women who are in hypogamous marriages, everything else equal, you have higher education. So you have a higher likelihood to participate in labor. Now, whether you are facing a male backlash, that is what we are going to find out. Right? So this is basically, we are assuming what is the correlation between the error term and the treatment.
And what if your assumption, would you find a weaker result then? Right now, with your assumption, actually the opposite of what you were saying in the beginning. So you're likely to find strong, weaker results with this assumption.
With this assumption.
Yeah. Because the probability of them joining the labor force is not less than the probability of them joining the labor force if they were in a non-hypogamous marriage. So, given that you're starting with something that they are in an advantageous position, but at the end you show that their likelihood is going down. So, if you were to flip this assumption, you would get stronger results.
No, I don't think it's a stronger result or weaker. The results would change, of course.
Yeah.
But again, you have to have a reason for why you would want to flip that assumption. So you can make an assumption of negative selection, but I mean, why would you assume to start with women who are in hypogamous marriages have a lower likelihood to participate in labor? We are saying that is the case because you are violating you're violating gender norm. We are sort of restricting that channel and saying that leave out that channel. What if you forget about that channel, which we are exploring? Then, if you take two women, then how do they compare? That's what we are saying.
In India, the labor force participation here we are saying the ability of our women is correlated with education. So, if we go by the previous paper, I would say that at the education level of our ability, they were labor force participation rate is 63, then would the assumption instead go.
Need to sort of reflect on that. So I don't have a good answer right now, but yeah, I mean that's something that we probably need to check whether that's what we're observing in the data as well. So. Okay, so this is one justification. The other justification that we think could be, could be somewhat sensible, is that we said that women who end up in hypogamous marriages, most of them end up almost by default. You can't find a partner who is more educated than you. So because you're sort of restricted by your network, so you end up marrying someone who's less educated. But very few, even if you assume one or two women, they might be actually entering into this marriage because their marital homes or their natal homes, marital homes basically in-laws, because those are less patriarchal. So there could be few cases where this is happening. Now, what that would mean that on average, if you include these women, on average, women who are in hypogamous marriages are going to be in an environment with better gender norms than the counterparts. So if you think of these women, there are only a minuscule sort of fraction of women who enter into this kind of a marriage because of better gender norms. So in that case, the average women in hypogamous groups are basically in an environment which has better gender norms. So some women have better gender norms, other women in that group have no worse gender norms. Right? So this can actually mean that on average, women in hypogamous marriages are relatively more likely to participate in the labor force to start with, because women who come from families that do not follow patriarchy, it is sort of asserted that they have a higher likelihood to participate in the labor force. Right? So this could be the second justification. So if you have any questions, feel free. Yeah. Yes.
That's what you began how I which you said is the default because there is no option available, right? And then again, you showed that the female literacy in rural areas is going as well, which would be a factor of choice. But if women and their families anticipate chances of domestic violence and them not ending up working to begin with, why is the trend coexisting?
So basically, why are women, why are women getting educated to start with? So that was something that we thought about, and I mean that's not, that hypogamy is rising, and hypogamy has some negative effects. This is well established, but still, so it's a more general question. Why do women go for more education? So to my mind, one reason could be that these policies, these cash transfer policies, that if you send your daughter to school for 10 years or whatever, you get it. So these actually are working. So these policies that the policymakers have devised, these actually are working. So therefore, because of those incentives, women go to school and so on. So this could be one reason. The other could be that the expectation, I'm sending my daughter to school for 12 years and then I take her out of school. But I don't know in the future whether, even if I suppose I send my daughter to school for 10 years, I don't even know whether in future the person who my daughter is going to get married, whether I'll find a groom. I might anticipate that I will find a groom who's more educated than the daughter, but I don't end up finding. So I think these reasons could, yeah.
Could I just add something?
Yeah.
You right now said that domestic violence is also anticipated and people end up not going through, which is the potential of them ending up, being abused. And if I am, as a family member, observing this to be the norm, I could anticipate similar patterns to be always tell us right? Because this is how patriarchy norms work. They don't change as frequently as we would like them to. So I'm not sure if the second reason that way of them anticipating the rules changing after 10 years.
Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, to my mind, these could be reasons. These could be the reasons. There might be other reasons which we might need to think of. But yeah, these trends are coexisting. There's no doubt about it. So one is that education is increasing of women, which is very clear. Hypogamous marriages are increasing, and we also know that hypogamous marriages, women who are in hypogamous marriages, large literature shows that those have negative effects on women's well. So there's no doubt about it. But yeah, so what could be the reason that women, why don't women endogenize that, and to start with they don't sort of maybe it could be that education, you get educated not just for the labor market, right? So there could be other positive effects which women take into account when they decide how much to get educated. Maybe patriarchy or whatever, women get educated to be good mothers as well, not just to be working in the labor market. So there could be other motivations of why women educate themselves to start with. Okay. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
So, sir, in hypogamous marriages, the wives actually have a comparative advantage in being the breadwinner, in the family. So, shouldn't that also lead to an increase in their participation in the labor force, and shouldn't that make up for the fall in the labor force because IPV?
I don't know. In theory, could be, but again, it depends on whether the opportunity, whether the work that wives perform, whether that sort of really fetches sufficient money for them to be going out to work, or whether the husband thinks that that's fine. You don't need to. If my wife loses out on income, that doesn't affect my household. So could be, I don't know.
I mean, IPV rates have increased quite a bit for it to drown out this effect of women in hypogamous marriages not joining the labor force, getting increasing rates.
Right.
Because they have an advantage, because they have more education qualifications. They have an advantage in actually joining the labor force and not the husbands.
Yeah,
So
but
I
it
think-
depends also on supply of jobs, demand for women labor. So if you assume that is also a channel which is working, then our story sort of fits.
So, sir, in different sectors of the labor market, has the fall in the women labor participation rate has been very different sectors of the labor force.
Yeah. So I'll just how long do I have? 10 minutes. So this is the last assumption that I'll talk about. This is basically so that was the so generally speaking, we start with no assumption on selection. We can't infer much. Then we make this assumption of positive selection. You can, in different contexts, you can make an assumption of negative selection. And then we go on to not assume. So basically find a variable which could be used as what is known as the monotone instrumental variable. So IV, everyone knows, right? You guys know what is IV. So MIV is sort of a weaker version of IV. So the only condition that needs to be satisfied by a variable to be used as MIV is that the potential outcomes, remember, it's the potential outcome that we're talking about, that must vary monotonically with the MIV. So if you can find a variable like that, you can use that in this setup. And the reason for using this is sort of to tighten the bounds. The idea is that you want a tight bound so that you can infer more. You can sort of find more from that. So the MIV that we use here is state literacy rate and GDP per capita, because we think that potential labor force participation rate monotonically varies. Potential participation, labor force participation rate of rural women monotonically varies with these variables. Right? Yes. Yes. Yeah. So basically, state GDP, we are basically saying that states which have higher GDP, potentially women are more likely to work in those states because the gender norms are better as well. Sorry?
That's not showing the data.
So I don't know, because we are talking about the potential. So if we are talking about the potential marked up. Yeah.
Not the actual.
No, we can't actually check this. Therefore, this is an assumption. All right. So there's a little bit of how you estimate these bounds and what are the biases that that sort of you need to deal with. So I'm sort of skipping this. I'm just going to show you the results, all pictures. So there's no tables and all. So the pictures are so the way to interpret the pictures is that. So we have two MIVs, right? Literacy, state literacy, and state GDP. So we start with say any picture take. So no assumptions that you have this bound of width 1, and then you have MTS which shrinks the bound, and then you have MTS combined with MIV1 and MTS combined with MIV2. So these black, whatever these are the estimated bounds, and the gray, I don't know whether you can see the gray patches behind. Those are the confidence intervals. State GDP or something, yeah. So it's just for a check, otherwise it's the same. So okay, so the first is that so how do you interpret? So these bounds are for the average treatment effect. So here, if you look at the MTS results, So it basically shows that the average treatment effect, for instance, whatever the paid employment in last 1 year, the average treatment effect lies between it's I think something yeah it's it. So it's negative 0.015 to negative 0.392, and then you have the confidence intervals. So all the average treatment effects, without even invoking, I think, the MIV assumption, all are negative. The MIV basically tightens the bounds, right? So that's for the NFHs, and then I have similar pictures for the IHTS, right? And I'll just summarize the results because I don't have much time, because I'll talk a little bit about the IP. So what do we find here is that if you just look at the bounds, you can see for certain that educational hypogamy leads to a significant decline in women's overall employment as well as paid employment. If you look at the magnitudes, what you can infer is that the decrease in women's likelihood of being currently employed in any job, that falls by 7 to 8%. So the difference between a woman in hypogamous marriage versus a woman in a non-hypogamous marriage, so the difference is around 7 to 8%. And if you look at the only paid employment, the current paid employment, the difference is around 4 to 5%. So similar figures we find for employment in the last 1 year. If you look at the IHTS, for currently employed in paid work, the figures look sensible. When you look at the AT for being the probability of being employed in work in the last 12 months, the figure is huge. One reason could be that if you work with IHTS data, IHTS data shows a much larger participation of women compared to any other source. And they have their reasons for it, and there's literature that talks about it, that how women's participation is measured and so on. But that's what we find. So there are sort of differences in the numbers, but overall it shows that the average treatment effect is negative. Yeah, I think it would be. When we started, we thought, IHTS, we sort of complement our NFHs by IHTS. Yeah, qualitatively it's the same. We haven't done the IPV using IHTS because IHTS doesn't have self-reported IPV. They capture IPV in a little bit different way. That what do you think? Does women in your community get beaten by their husbands for it? So we haven't used that part, but maybe we will use that later. So robustness checks, these are all for journal referee. Okay, so then we move on to look at the mechanism. So the question is, okay, this happened, but can we say anything about the mechanism? Could it be that women in hypogamous marriages have, are more vulnerable to IPV? We examine that in the same sort of way, and we compute the bounds. And we compute the bounds for the 4 different types of violence, the 4 different types of IPV that you can see in the data. Less severe sexual violence, and emotional violence. And all these bounds are strictly positive. Right? So the bounds are not extremely tight, but these bounds at least tell you that the effect is positive. So basically, if you're in a hypogamous marriage, you have a higher likelihood of experiencing these kinds of violence. And if you look at any violence, which is any violence you face out of the 4, or anticipation of violence, that is, are you afraid of your husband? It seems that women say that, yeah, if I'm in a hypogamous marriage, I'm afraid of my husband. Right? So I'm sort of more afraid of my husband compared to the counterpart. So this is basically, we've done a paper earlier also, not exactly for rural India, but we have a paper in the Journal of Royal Statistical Society, Gaurav and I. So we have found similar results there as well. So overall, this is the best we could do for challenge. So this provides some kind of a suggestive evidence. So see, we found that hypogamy leads to lower labor force participation. At the same time, we find that hypogamy leads to higher violence. So we say that, this provides some suggestive evidence. Suggestive is something that we would like to stress on, that a channel through which this effect operates, or the link between hypogamy and women's labor force participation, is change in women's exposure to actual or anticipated IP. All right, so last two slides, I'll just conclude. So there's clear evidence from our analysis that compared to women in non-hypogamous marriages, women in hypogamous marriages are less likely to participate in the labor force. And therefore, it is possible that the decline in female labor force participation rate that we observe in rural India could be attributed to the rising educational hypogamy. Right? So the conclusion that we would draw here is that, first is that we are not suggesting that don't educate women. So I presented this in a conference which was sort of an interdisciplinary with a lot of sociologists, and also they jumped from into that. You are saying that you should educate women. We are not saying that at all. We've not lost our mind. So we are not saying that. We are just saying that you educate women, but just don't rly on Kanyashri or Beti Bachao Beti Padhao, right? Those policies, of course, you should. I mean, there is no reason to say that keep women in. There's nobody in sane mind would say that. I actually had thought of putting a warning out, but whatever. This is not a sociology argument. So we are not saying that. What we are saying is that you could be educating women, but that could actually be backfiring. So you should be aware of that and be cautious about, how you want to tackle problems that are related to women, right? So if you actually want to arrest this trend of this declining, female labor force participation rate, and if you want rural women, if you want them to come back to work, what we think, what this paper sort of suggests is that gender norms, you should be working towards changing gender norms, right? This gender norm that women shouldn't, my wife should be falling behind me. My wife shouldn't be the person who has no education, or the hypogamy is against patriarchy. That is something So these gender norms should be changed. Now, gender norms are sticky. It's not so easy. I can write this in a paper and people can talk about this on social media and so on. But it's not easy. Gender norms are sticky. But it turns out that there are some hopes. There are policies and nudges that one can think of. That if you could address gender bias at the young age, like if you just engage young girls and boys in classroom discussions about gender equality, or if you make them interact with female role models, these things seem to go along, right? So this is basically what we are trying to say, and that's where our paper is.
Is it higher for more educated women in
absolute education, I don't know. I don't know. I have to check.
And what do you know about the returns to education in what time?
Check that also. But like,
Why I'm asking you?
Yeah.
So it show that the activity is in general higher than more educated women, and then more educated women is generally more likely to get to hypogamy marriages. So it is likely that is what is the marriage is
all right.
And another thing, why I asked for the returns to education and because say you are concerning a variables in the government, whether more educated or less, right? So now you have if we have, say, constitution for 1 year of schooling is insignificant, not that so there is the graduation for the education as such, even if you are educated, so people will understand, okay, the God has been more educated because the policy project by the government and things like that. It actually doesn't happen. Value education is business, it is a source of money by parents, of course. Right, so in that way, there is not likely to be violence here. Right? Or there is no value in it, so there will be.
I see what you're
also, but it's actually great. Then perhaps the argument will not.
We'll check that. We'll check that. I mean, I have to check that. Thank you.
So I have 3 points to make. First, the clarification. Some MIP would be that if you go back to your assumption on the state level literacy rate, so that would mean that if the literacy rate increases, the chances of women participating in the labor market would increase. Is that right?
So we are basically saying that the women is potentially more likely to participate in the labor force in a higher literacy state compared to lower.
Right. Right. So relatedly, second point, you're basically assuming positive monotone state, right? So so this is actually, you know, your point in saying that if it's your MIV, like you said, it's tightening the bounds, actually, you know, complementing your positive monotone, your positive monotone assumption, right? That is the reason that I see actually tightening the bounds. But I don't see a reason why I don't to assume negative monotone selection. I mean, a more thorough would, I mean, in my case, because you begin with your ultimate, that's how you actually ended up motivating that, you know, it's possible that if there is educational hypogamy, then, you know, it is possible that women may tend to work less. I mean, they may not be able to go out and work. So what prevents you from, you know, not assuming negative monotone selection?
So so Bharti probably asked a similar question. So what I said that the MTS assumption basically makes an assumption saying that forget about the treatment channel. So conditional on the treatment, what can you say about the two groups? So what you are saying is that, okay, I have motivated my paper because through the treatment effect channel, right? You are saying if that is working, then that goes against my assumption. But monotonicity or MTS basically says that that is not what we are considering. We are saying that there are two groups. Conditional on treatment assignment, can you say that, you know, one group is better off than the other? And if that is the case, what? So other than this particular channel or the particular treatment that we're considering, how would you compare the two groups? If you take that constant, if you make the treatment constant, how would you compare the two?
Potential.
Yeah.
So, last point, probably this is how.
So this is a assumption that I have had a hard time convincing, like explaining. Assumption. But yeah, so I understand your point.
And last, this is my take on your policy implication.
Yeah.
So what I understand from this paper is that the policy implication does not exactly follow from what you presented regarding the gender norms. To me, it actually seems like there is a problem in the matching market. Exactly what Professor Bharti said. So it's actually what you showed. To me, I felt it's something happening in the marriage market, and probably something that's what I would want to see in the policy implication. If you can say, gender norms is not something you are actually referring to.
But what is happening in the marriage market? In the marriage market, because women are getting educated more, they end up marrying, men who are less educated. That creates the problem, right? And why is that the problem? Because that is not permitted by patriarchy. The patriarchy doesn't like that.
But that would be more of an indirect conclusion to me, at least for the policy. I mean, for the policy.
So what could, yeah. So What could be the direct conclusion? Like, what could be the direct conclusion? Because ultimately the problem stems from the fact that this kind of marriage is not accepted. Like, we don't like this kind of. So for you to make someone like this kind of a marriage, what do you need?
So in the ideal experiment, since the way I would think of this is, if I gave an intervention wherein I educated a few families regarding the norms and the others were the controls, they are as it is, and then I find something changing in the treatment group wherein I ended up educating, say, the mother-in-law.
Are you talking about RCT?
Yeah, I'm saying that's the ideal experiment to make that conclusion I would think of, and not some sort of at least in terms of the partial bounds, you're just bounding the treatment effect. So in that sense, I would find it hard to follow. It is so that's my take on it.
All right, thanks. Yeah.
So about IPV as a channel where education hypergamy might affect the labor market, labor force participants.
That is right.
The channel might also be that women who are marrying men who are less educated than them, these men might have a better job than these women who bring it in. And that's compensating for the education gap between the husband and wife. So, do we check for the employment of these men? Do they have first, if they have a better employment, then we see that the household income or labor force participation of women goes down. So if these are the household with higher income, then that follows that these women will have a lower labor force.
Yeah, I understand your point. So hypergamous marriages, so non-hypogamous marriages, but for your point to be valid, I'm not saying it's not valid, but for it to be definitely valid, in absolute terms, you should say that women, the men in hypogamous marriages have higher education and therefore better jobs. I don't know whether that's the case. We can definitely check for that. We can check the kind of occupation they are in. Yeah.
Check female if ITV is high, then women may want to participate more in the game. And if they are at home, they may
So that's
they may be more connected.
yeah, they may be. We haven't checked, but they may be. You're right. But the overwhelming evidence that we have from prior literature is that your exposure to domestic violence, or whatever what I said about Seema Jayachandra's paper, also that if you anticipate that you're going to be exposed to domestic violence, you sort of don't want to go to the labor market. That's what the existing evidence is, but we haven't.
Because they might want to go out for work if they are at home.
Yeah. I understand it. And what was the first point that you made? You were talking about.
Yeah, so the increase in electricity rate being
Yeah.
matched by the increase in
Job creation. Yeah, we haven't checked.
Because whatever the work is being done, if that is not the scenario, then it makes sense that people are unemployed. And with the increase in electricity, the participation.
Yeah. We'll check that. Yes.
So isn't the 18 conservative estimate a potential outcome, the potential difference would have been large because it's positive the assumption that would have been larger. That is why your 18 is the conservative estimate to that value of the
No, the reason, if I'm following the question correctly, is that the reason we are using the NPS assumption is that without the MTS assumption, we don't have any information. We just know that it could be anything in this bound, which is of width 1. It could be 0, it could be positive, it could be negative, 18. With MTS, the bound shrinks. We are trying to sort of narrow the bound with imposing assumptions that make sense. So to our mind, we think that this assumption makes sense, and using that, we've shrunk the bound and trying to get some information out of that. That's what we're doing. Yeah, there's one. I think you can just shoot.
So, talking about education, hypogamy itself is challenging with gender norms, right? And then concluding that gender norms are sticky is being a contradictory statement. No, there could be another challenge that could be an effect that is leading to decline in the female labor force participation. Like women getting educated for being a better homemaker.
Yeah.
So just identifying the IPV as a potential channel, is it in that sense, right?
It is, we are just saying it's one channel. You can think of 1,000 more channels. But why do you think it's contradictory?
Because like if you are showing that the educational hypogamy is increasing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
so
that's exactly what I said when I started.
that means the society is progressing.
No, exactly no. That's what I have a slide for that. It doesn't mean that the society is progressing. It just so where's this slide? So this slide was meant for that. So the first thing that comes to our mind is okay, marriages are becoming different, society is changing, the norms are changing. But literature clearly asserts that's not the case. It is women are getting married to men of lower economic status because the pool that they have to choose, the marital pool or the marriage pool, that is constrained by these characteristics like caste and kinship network. So women are getting more educated because of policies and all. Therefore, the pool shrinks, and almost by default, most of the women who end up in hypogamous marriages actually enter those marriages. It's not because therefore this slide is important to make that argument that gender norms are not changing.
So this hypogamy is just based upon their education level or their social class as well. So these marriages are intercaste or not.
These are in India. There's almost no intercaste marriages, right? I mean, you won't find. If you look at any data, you will find very few intercaste marriages. So all are within castes, within kinship networks, and therefore these pools shrink. You end up marrying someone who's less educated. And this paper actually talks quite a bit about this. So that's Sonal Desai's paper in Demography 2020.
Thank you. So you also have information on the labor force participation of the same women just before marriage.
In India, you don't have any of those information. So it's NFHs, right? So it's a cross section. So you just have this information that whether you're working now, working in the last 1 year. The only way probably is that somebody who's been married in the last, but again, then you can't say that whether before marriage that remembers.
Adding to what you said, so might be more educated just to enter the marriage market and without having intentions of working thereafter.
Yeah, could be. I mean, this was sort of asked to me earlier also. Could be. We haven't thought about it, but yeah, possible.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.